Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this wonderful session today. I'm really enjoying it. So my topic, as you'll see, pushing diversity beyond recognition. So the presence and priorities of a range of social groups in the city has really been a subject of interest in urban studies for a century. Think back to the Chicago School, which indeed was a century ago. And this is certainly the case in my own discipline of urban geography and in the social planning parts of urban planning in which I've had some involvement. The idea of diversity, as I see it, principally refers to the varied characteristics of the population, often also with specific reference to their situatedness in place. But I note that the term now also has a significant presence in research and practice about organisations, and particularly there's a lot of resonance, I think, for urban studies people thinking about the term diversity in a critical manner if they read work in critical management studies. But focus on the idea of diversity in critical urban studies, I think derives from feminist critiques since the 1970s of class-based conceptualisations of urbanisation and urban life. And those critiques of that class-based thinking have been, or originally were arguing that gender difference was inadequately captured in prevailing theorisations of class. And of course that's extended way beyond those initial 1970s arguments. But theoretically and politically, the way we use the concept of diversity and indeed the work it does for us in applied settings has become quite contentious in the last 3 decades. It's a term which sits with discussions about normative constructs like multiculturalism, identity-related politics and policies, as we've already mentioned today, and the recognition of difference. All of these terms, with, it seems to me, diversity in the middle of them as the most theoretically underspecified, have guided ways in which social scientists have tried to understand and accommodate the needs of the variety of social groups in places. So the terms that I've just mentioned have sort of formed a conceptual apparatus by which we've been able to get past the notion of an undifferentiated public or an inadequately differentiated public in our societies. The concepts have become an apparatus which has also enabled us to analyse the embodied forms of injustice as well as justice in the city, particularly the racialised and sexualised forms of this. So theoretical and political critiques have grown about the possibly too strong focus on variation and difference, which terms like diversity encourage us to take. So in this talk, I want to raise some of the alternatives to a focus on diversity as recognition of separateness and difference, which a response to these critiques, I think, requires us to consider. So how may we retain our sensitivity to the presence of a variety of social groups and interests in the places of our cities and indeed elsewhere, and yet still appreciate the interests in common that we share? So I'm going to have 2 sections in my talk, as you'll see on the slide. First of all, I'll talk a bit about diversity thinking in urban studies and practice, focusing on the question of norms, the question of identity, as we've mentioned already, the issue of whether diversity in fact hides difference. Then I'll talk briefly about some of the alternatives that I think focus on placing diversities as they sit together in the city rather than looking at them as separate things. And so these alternatives are notions of encounter, notions of invisibility and the stranger, notions of the commons, and the new policy discussion about interculturalism. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about diversity thinking in urban studies and practice. So the first characteristic of diversity thinking, it seems to me, is that it's usually normative. In writing about the city and policies about the city and planning practices and so on, diversity is often sought after as a good thing. But this needs to be interrogated. As Loretta Lees commented a decade ago, the diversity of different diversities is often under-theorised. She meant that it's not enough in urban research to describe or embrace variations and quaint examples where things are done differently between us. Rather, we need to identify those accepted forms of diversity in our communities that cause damage to some groups or render them inferior, as well as focusing on the good sides of this. Then our work can single out harmful judgments and canvass ways to reduce the injustice meted out to people having certain characteristics. So Kurt Iveson's and my 2008 book that Kate just mentioned which was about planning and diversity. And I note that I really wanted to call it planning for the company of strangers, but we weren't allowed and we had to use the term diversity, as I think I was saying earlier. So we identified 3 norms: redistribution, recognition and encounter, which we posited as the core values of progressive social planning. And these norms, we thought, would direct us to seeing any negative manifestations of difference or diversity in specific ways so that these could be counted. And we thought that the concepts or the norms would also direct us to finding examples of justice thinking and successful seeking of justice or justice practice in urban social planning. I think we often tend to focus too much on documenting the injustices and not enough the wonderful justice achievements that there are. So I think that the use of theorised norms has, in recent writing, however, been subject to challenge, and many have asked how on earth can broad concepts from philosophy possibly be of use in revealing the lived diversities of daily life in the city. Indeed, some writers in my own discipline of geography have rejected entirely the use of philosophically posited norms at all. So Clive Barnett, for example, claims that instead we should see norms as intuited in the material practice of social groups or activist movements, as things that evolve in the moment rather than as strictures on practice or things that are previously known. With the materialist and performative turn of contemporary critical urban studies, the locating of norms in practice rather than above and outside daily practice is certainly important. So if I look at a second characteristic of diversity thinking, I would say that it is that diversity thinking focuses a lot of attention on groups defined with respect to an individual attribute or identity feature. For example, ethnicity, gender, age, sexuality. It can be locked into classifying groups, thus detracting from a focus on people of diverse characteristics intersecting together. Further, this way of thinking about diversity can lead to the researcher or the institution or policymaker really seeing groups and the people within them as actually defined by such single characteristics, a kind of sort of social ecological fallacy. I think back to a large study in which I was involved in the late 2000s, where the purpose was to find out how international students in central Melbourne were creating a sense of belonging for themselves as new and temporary immigrants through encounters with their peers. And in that study, much attention was paid to interactions between the central group of students that the university saw, which was international students, and the other group that they saw of domestic students. And so we as researchers also saw those two groups in our work, international students and domestic students. The result of that overspecification of student groups via institutional identities was that we tended to see the encounters that we thought were positive, seeking out these normative forms of interaction, and these were interactions across difference, as interactions between international students and domestic students where both groups were defined really too much as if they were relatively homogeneous. We tended, I think, looking back on it, to devalue interactions within cohorts of international students as of less value. And in fact, of course, great diversity exists within the group international students in our major cities, as it does indeed within the group one might call domestic students. And interactions within those groups created belonging and networks and activities just as much as interactions did across them. So Kurt Iveson and I have distinguished between affirmative models of recognition and relational ones. Here, affirmative models of recognition define groups with reference to their pre-existing characteristics, and policies often seek to protect that group so that its members can be themselves. Such thinking, of course, as you'll know, can become essentialist and confining. There is the much more satisfactory idea of relational models of recognition in which identity groups are understood to be formed through a politics of difference rather than existing prior to these politics. Indeed, as we said way back then, collective attachments to particular identity groups are formed precisely through attempts to mobilise for a particular purpose. So the Canadian geographer Linda Peake has referred to the importance of, quote, the constitutive outside, unquote, in understanding identity. If I move to a third feature of diversity thinking, it's the point that it can actually camouflage or hide difference. unjust differences that render groups as unequal. Recent discussions of diversity in workplaces have made this point. So the wonderful Sarah Ahmed, in her book On Being Included, has examined the adoption by institutions, by universities in fact, of the language of diversity. And she investigates, quote, what diversity does by focusing on what diversity obscures. That is, the relationship between diversity and racism, unquote. And Ahmed notes that once institutional discourses of diversity arrive, a relative silence about terms like equality, social justice and equal opportunities also arrives. Racism, she says, as a judgmental practice able to be identified in the workplace is discursively and imaginatively more remote once diversity is an institutional norm, in her findings. So in the minds of some analysts of organisations, diversity has become decoupled from its 1970s origins in progressive thinking with social justice aims. It's become, in many places, a management aim. So in a very recent paper, Ahonen et al. Say, quote, diversity is no longer linked to histories of discrimination, colonialism, diaspora and economic exploitation, but rather to individualisable, productive sources on which competitive advantage can be secured, unquote. So these authors end their account, interestingly, with a hope, another norm, that rather than focusing on diversity in organisations, we might identify and develop analyses of sameness in organisations in order to paint that sameness as utterly provincial and banal. If this is a view from critical management studies about the use of diversity in organisations, how does diversity sit in our social planning interventions in the built environment and our conceptualisations of life in the city? The valuable research and writing of Leonie Sandercock over several decades still stands as pivotal on this point. And you'll remember that she started foregrounding the contributions of women to planning practice despite their absence from the canons of planning literature, and proceeded to examining immigrant communities, and then now is focusing on First Nations peoples and their ways of planning. So this kind of work showcases the importance of seeing diverse ways of living and making sure a variety of voices are heard and incorporated into interventions in the city. We have to know and see these ways of living before knowing what these voices might be. So the writing of people like Andrew Gorman Murray on homemaking by same-sex couples in the Australian city, particularly Sydney, that exposes the heteronormativity of our thinking about home. The research of various writers on young people in cities, for example, my colleague Kurt Iveson's work on graffiti culture and practice. Work on ways of life of recent immigrants, like former work of Susan Thompson and Kevin Dunn in Western Sydney. Wendy Shaw's work on Indigenous people and the gentrification of inner Sydney. All this research is hugely significant, for it's making visible the voices that must be heard. But the question is how to know those presences and ways of living without judging them pejoratively, and how to recognise them relationally rather than statically and affirmatively. So I think a range of alternatives is emerging in urban studies from this critique of diversity thinking and its focus on too narrow a form of recognition. Marking diversity and difference is still a highlight of progressive work in urban studies, but the focus, I think, of these alternatives is, as I've said, on the sitting together of diversities produced in any given situation. Perhaps with acceptance that our cities are by definition heterogeneous sites of multiculture, we can now accept that recognition of single identity groups as a practice of diversity thinking has had its day. But having said that, and knowing the drawbacks of mainstreaming everything, which are that the less powerful amongst the different lose their place in an unidentified public, is it possible to see diversity as lived in the moment and multiply expressed rather than being presumed in advance? Can we see diversity sitting together rather than separating them from their fellows? So I want to move on then to my next section of seeing diversity sitting together instead of singled out. And in this section, I want to consider 4 conceptual entry points, as I've said, to thinking about diversity from this alternative perspective of seeking out diversities in their togetherness. And the concepts I'll raise have many points in common, but I single them out here just for discussion. And they are, as I've said, encounter, interculturalism, invisibility and the stranger, and the idea of the commons. So first on encounter, on which I have written a bit. So I think there's a great deal of writing going on at present about encounter in urban studies, and some important parts of it come from this very city of Sydney. I think it's possible to use the encounter as an epistemological strategy in comprehending how individuals and groups relate to each other in the material and political context of the city, around its built forms, its institutions, its place-based cultures. That's to say, one can choose to view people in the city as participants in encounters and to build knowledge about that as an important part of our knowledge about the city, rather than seeing people as residents of certain suburbs or kinds of housing, or as members of defined groups statically located in certain areas as the population census might depict them. Encounters do define human existence, so looking at them is a logical step as a focus for forming knowledge about urban and social life. And it might turn our interventions and practices round a bit to think of diversity in that way. Encounters are interactions of the moment, often convivial, sometimes not, sometimes fleeting and with unknown strangers, such as at a music festival. Equally, they can be with people who are familiar to us or, as I often think, accountable to us because of the context in which we meet them, even if we don't know them personally. So think of having a meeting with a real estate agent or a service provider whom you mightn't personally know, but you can go back to them and see them again. Writing on urban encounter tends to see that activity as myriad micro-scale examples of interaction, often across difference, and as interactions which are to be documented really simply for their richness and how they show the complexity of urban life and make it visible. Questions of the actual significance of encounters may not be prominent in some of these accounts, although, of course, the picture they present of the affirming nature of many cross-cultural encounters does put paid to the frequent claims of some national political leaders that policies of multiculturalism have failed. So we've seen recently a wonderful edited book edited by the Sydney authors Wise and Vela Youtham, which articulate this really deeply situated approach by naming the diverse attributes of people, for example, using their shopping mall, their local shopping mall in suburban Sydney. And they say, quote, the shopping mall can be a site of conviviality, of light touch rubbing along, of competition for space, everyday racism and cross-cultural discomforts, of consumption, of interethnic exchange and hybridity, encounter and hospitality, unquote. Now, one really should warn that the convivial possibilities that encounters like this appear to offer should not be overdrawn. In a recent review of what they term the convivial turn, giving rise to studies of everyday multiculture, some British authors, Neil and Vincent, have also emphasised that maintaining interactions between people of cultural and indeed class differences requires competence, dedication and skill. It really requires labour. And their study, which is of friendship development between the parents of school children from different ethnic and religious backgrounds in Britain, in a British locality, really shows the ongoing effort involved in avoiding withdrawal from difference and for cultural translation between group members. Other writing about encounter has sought to ask also of the significance of encounters. So why is it important to study encounter in its placed detail? To what positive and progressive outcomes might some encounters give rise, but not others? The British geographer Jill Valentine, for one, has been very concerned at claims that envisage new kinds of urban citizenship deriving from intercultural encounters, and that would see the development of cross-cultural programs in sites like schools as potentially scaling up a broader respect for difference. She finds that proximity and contact doesn't necessarily lead to respect for different others, and that it can even cement divisions and prejudice. I must say that I don't see the ambiguity of encounter, the uncertainty of its outcomes, as a reason not to foster it in the city. Most of us, I think, dislike separation and confinement as strategies for dealing with the messy diversity and disorder of city life. So it follows that conviviality and contact are to be encouraged as giving some meaning to urbanity, for the alternative is segregation, which we nearly all dismiss. The transformative potential of such encounters are matters, I think, to be examined as to their spatiality and its outcomes, and we see writers like Andy Merrifield currently trying to do this in looking at the big Occupy protests that occurred a couple of years ago. So encounter then, as I raise it, is a frame of reference that positions interactions as the centrepiece of the analysis of urban diversity. It encompasses interactions that are tiny and fleeting, all the way up to interactions that are massed, repeated and sustained through time and space. It emphasises the importance of bodily presence, of physical and material togetherness, emplaced and in the moment, and the contingency of the outcomes that might ensue. So I move to my second conceptual entry point, that of invisibility and the stranger. So if one is seeking to divest diversity thinking of its focus, it's a narrow kind of focus on identity, then some writers have claimed that a certain invisibility or imperceptibility, akin to being a stranger, is important as a norm to think about. This writing seeks to remove the labels that classify us and our self-classification through those labels, deriving, as these labels do, from bureaucratic attempts to manage us and our differences. So, for example, writing about undocumented migration in Europe and drawing from the thinking of Deleuze about the idea of social actors as always becoming and evolving, Papadopoulos and Tsianos argued that, quote, interestingly enough, the end of all becomings is not the proliferation of diversity and difference, but its disappearance. Becoming imperceptible is the imminent end of all becoming. It is a process of becoming everybody, everything, of eliminating the use of names, unquote. So their illustrative example, which is probably a more extreme one than we usually deal with in our urban studies here, is of undocumented migrants seeking settlement in a new country in Europe and destroying the documents that identify them before they get assessed for refugee status. So these people want to become imperceptible or invisible. Closer to home, in the project of mine to which I referred earlier about student immigrants from overseas establishing themselves in central Melbourne as temporary immigrants, one interviewee was quite clear to us that he wished to divest himself of the label always applied to him, that of being a Chinese student. This label meant he was constantly expected to be in a group of Chinese co-nationals as if they were his preferred familiars, and to be seeking interactions with local Australian students from his identified position of difference as a Chinese student. He had, he said, not come to Melbourne merely to be thought of as Chinese. His interest was in classical music, and he wanted to associate with others, no matter what their ethnicity, who shared that passion with him. The lack of sophistication of the labelling he endured really surprised and pained him. Thus, we see that one way of delabelling people is for them to participate with others who share their interests, as in the micro-publics identified by Ash Amin as grounding and positive for urban life. The figure of the stranger, that invisible or imperceptible or unlabelled individual, has been very important in analyses of city life over the decades. Think back to the 19th century flaneur. Iris Marion Young famously defined urban life as, quote, the being together of strangers, unquote. Yet this is not to say that every urban inhabitant experiences their strangeness equally, that every urban inhabitant is viewed appreciatively by others who are being actively open to strangers. Nor is it to say that urban inhabitants will be able to shed all identity categories because it's through these that they're publicly viewed, whether they wish it or not. So normatively, where do we go with the search for encouraging imperceptibility and strangeness, for anticipating hybridity in people's identifications rather than fixed labels? Amin, as ever, has a response. He always does, a very eloquent one. He sees the need to both facilitate the co-presence of strangers spatially and socially, and also to encourage negotiation between strangers that are characterised by, quote, a politics of respectful distance and principled disagreement, unquote. He defends a politics of difference, as he sees it, formed around the impersonal, the openly disputed and the public, unquote. So you see here the claim that social relationships can positively be impersonal and indifferent and between strangers. And I think this is a very important distinction and different from the viewpoint of those who assert the need for cross-cultural encounter and contact to be about intimacy, closeness and friendship. Amin, long the proponent of the value of micropublics as a way for strangers to be together, also theorises the social learning that results from his, quote, techniques of alignment between heterogeneous bodies when the stranger brings unexpected potentialities to the collective endeavour, unquote. So as with research on encounter, perspectives on strangeness and its potential for vibrant and inclusive city living emphasise the of-the-moment nature of the micropublics that take up strangers. And it seems to me that the delivery opportunities from this analysis are obvious to support urban spaces in which these hybridities and forms of strangeness can be brought together in micropublics, as Amin would see it. I moved to look at the commons, the third concept I'll talk about. And into the critical urban studies literature is creeping the idea of the commons. This is not the public and the public interest, that representation of undifferentiated blobs of citizens who are all to be treated alike, and against which notion in planning Leonie Sandercock's very earliest writing was directed. Rather, the commons emerges from thinking about ethical decision-making by communities, however one defines those, who commit to sharing something together and are defined by that commitment. So Gibson Graham, in their book A Post-Capitalist Politics, give their sense of this. Quote, "Our definition of the commons accords with that of those who see shared interest or value forming the base of a community and being inseparable from it, as opposed to the more narrow definition of an open access or common pool material resource that's separable from a human community," unquote. So involved in the idea of the commons is a commitment and an ethics that are not necessarily present in the idea of micropublics, or what Amin calls prosaic collaborations. Gibson Graham explore aspects of ethical decision-making in the community economies they examine, including the decision to replenish or enlarge the commons that defines these communities. And here the communal resource might be, in different contexts, affordable housing or community gardening facilities or worker-owned and community-based producer cooperatives. Amin, in fact, sees this principle of the commons as a way to rescue the idea of the public, and says the principle of the commons is recovered as a staple of the society of strangers, intended as both an enabling public sphere and a provisioning collective resource, unquote. So he supports the need for a return to the idea of the social state and for an active and, importantly, agonistic public sphere. I don't think there's anything particularly new in that claim. But I think it does lead us in the built environment disciplines and planning and so on to really reflect on how actively we consider the social in the production of any commons in which we engage. And I just note that that wonderful slide on the screen is a really old tiled shopping mall in Dandenong in the southeast of Melbourne, which the council there has used for start-up businesses by new immigrant arrivals. It's a community of many new immigrant communities. And so you see those two guys there, originally from Sudan, who've been setting up a men's clothing store in one of the tiny little shops in the mall. So in this context of thinking about the social and the commons that we might be involved in as built environment or social planning professionals, I've got a pretty challenging quote from a community services provider from the city of Dandenong in southeast Melbourne, the most ethnically diverse municipality in my city. And this quote comes from interviews in a placemaking study in which I was involved there a few years ago with Kate Shaw and Marie Pardy. And you'll see how the community services work, as described by the local manager who's reporting it to us, really focuses most ethically on forming a commons of maternal and infant health care via a social role for the state. And you'll see how the community services manager here is really clearly committed to both recognition and redistribution as norms for providing services to immigrants. But his municipality struggles with the recognition task when recognition is based on ethnic and national identity as articulated precisely by the immigrant and refugee groups themselves, and when economic need is so great as well. So we said to him, what do you see as the major challenges? Nice specific question. And he said 150 nationalities and half of them want their own dedicated space and we can't give it to them. He said, and I'm quoting him here at some length, they put a huge demand on us, huge. Elected local councillors get quite reactive to it. They get very conservative. To the outsider, it could be interpreted as racism. It is actually protection from setting up precedents. You say yes to one and you open the floodgate to all, and then our budget just isn't going to handle it. Our service demand system is just massive. The maternal and child health model is a universal model of access for mothers with babies, built on a European white Anglo concept. 15 minutes for a session where you can be in and out, baby weighed, a bit of advice. Here, in Dandenong, sessions are each 45 minutes and you've got to have an interpreter, so the cost overlay for us to manage is large. And we're funded on a universal model from the state government, and council kicks in the rest. But I've got to tell you, the state government does not give us a bonus for the complexity that we deal with. You run that across every arm of community services, across aged care, across family services, across early years, across library services. There is a cost infrastructure for doing the right thing, the ethical point, and we don't get funded to do it. The ratepayers of this community pay for it, so multiculturalism has a huge impact on this municipality. And he said, now some critics have come and said, well, that's wrong. You're reinforcing it. You're reinforcing cultural difference. But we're saying we get the message about services like maternal and child health within the cultural setting. Here, sometimes it's the community elders that have more to say than anyone else. We have to figure out who they are. So it's a very complex social fabric here. We've got some cultures that are incredibly patriarchal, and we've got some cultures that are incredibly matriarchal. Yet our service model and delivery system has certain inbuilt assumptions about that, and we struggle to understand the nuances sometimes, unquote. So I think we might ask ourselves, thinking about planning here, if planning is actively seeking to create a commons as a social act, in the way that community services personnel in that example from local government in Dandenong actively try to do. Where is the equivalent ethically formed commons occurring in planning practice in places? On another level, the delivery of urban interventions based on thinking about the commons directs us firmly to the positive features of the cooperative tenure form in housing, on which topic I applaud the work of Louise Crabtree here in New South Wales. It also directs us to the cooperative workplace as well as to the cooperative facilities of recreation, where cooperation in the public sphere, I think we could say mainly now sits in things like gardening, community services provision, community arts and so on. I move to my final little concept or point of entry, conceptual point of entry here, and talk about interculturalism instead of multiculturalism. And this is at a different register from my comments so far. So in this different register, this time we're talking about national policy priorities and the way these play out at lower levels of government. And so we can take up the concept of interculturalism, which is in some places of the world appearing in place of multiculturalism. It is the response in some European countries and in Canada at the national policy level to what have been seen as divisive outcomes of the recognition of immigrant groups by their ethnicity, on which multiculturalism has been based. With the broad policy philosophy of interculturalism, bodies like the Council of Europe say this seeks to forge what they call common ground between culturally diverse groups, as well as recognising their differences. So again, Sandercock and her co-writer Artili wrote in 2009 about the Canadian city of Vancouver, where they see interculturalism in practice as a reflection of the national policy norm of that kind operating in Canada. But they also, in fact, see it as a shift within Canadian multiculturalism. So they say, quote, one very important aspect of Canada's evolving political culture at federal government level, especially in the past decade, has been the effort to create a sense of national identity and national belonging that is grounded in ideals of active citizenship, democracy and political community, rather than in notions of Canadianness grounded in race or ethnicity, which they say is what is still going on in Europe. And you might ask yourself whether it's going on here too, I think. This very important shift, they say, is also a shift in the meaning of multiculturalism from its earlier incarnation, emphasising recognition and support of all immigrant cultures, to an intercultural position emphasising the building of bridges between cultures, unquote. And in fact, they note this has been accompanied by actual funding shifts in Canada. Now, policies supporting interculturalism do require as basic a set of societal expectations that difference is not to be maligned, and a set of regulations and practices that protect that right to difference in its many forms. So Sandercock indeed lists things like freedom of speech, participatory public spaces, empowered citizens, agreed procedures and basic ethical norms, and the active policing of discriminatory practices as the set of social expectations that we need to have in our national cultures. And indeed, I see these institutional preconditions as a major part of the common ground that interculturalism actually seeks to find. I also think that these common grounds were a very great part of our multiculturalism here in Australia and also in Canada, even if we might have started to reinterpret multiculturalism a bit differently over the years. But advocates of interculturalism are certainly putting this idea forward as a new norm. And I think it's interesting to note the sort of three basic policy strategies they have as part of this push to make more visible interculturalism. So they are the idea of exchange and the promotion of positive interaction, so nothing to be negative here, not interested in conflict, just positive interaction. So this is really heavily invested in ideas of social inclusion. Second, there is the idea of working towards equality and access to citizenship, which of course you can't do at the local level where most of this is manifested, but you can get participatory citizenship interactions going even at the local level. And third, establishing what some have called a diversity advantage. And I'm thinking here of the recent book by Zapata Barrero, where there's discussion of how you might promote the benefits of diversity and be emphasising that it's not a nuisance that we have to limit or manage. So you can see that in this idea of interculturalism, there's no thinking about invisibility or imperceptibility or strangeness. There certainly are still stated differences between groups interacting who are still sitting there in the city in their groupness, being encouraged to have these interactions. And so in Europe, it's often the distinction between the immigrant and the citizen, that insider-outsider notion that's verbally stated very, very visibly. But I think there is a focus in this type of perspective on the interactions themselves as a priority, as is certainly a feature of thought and practice based on encounter. So I want to just make a tiny point in conclusion. Must have missed one. So, implications of what I've said. Why would we bother, as I've said, talking about this stuff? So I think taking up the idea that there are new ways to work with diversity, pushing it beyond narrow forms of recognition in our theory and practice as urbanists is important. And I've tried to note the beginnings being made to conceptualise diversity anew. Through the materialistic turn in critical urban studies that has us focusing on activities, practices and performances in the moment, actual interactions between groups of people, and indeed within those groups of people and between groups and non-human others, which is a whole other discussion, we can go beyond the easy labelling and categorisation of city dwellers. Note that in no sense does this remove the need to acknowledge the identity categories that are borne by city dwellers in their lives, because this is how they're seen by others and by institutions through the politics of difference and judgment in which we all live. Classifications of our bodies are everywhere, legally everywhere. So I note, for example, Kurt Iveson's wonderful analysis of the legal battle in Sydney in the 1990s to retain McIver's pool at Coogee Beach for the use of women and children, when men used the equal opportunity provisions of legislation to contest this practice of reserving a public place for certain groups rather than others. This situation evokes how things are officially, but also how they can be teased out subtly in practice in the courts when challenged. It demonstrates how setting aside certain public places for certain users under some conditions is just. It's also important to note that cross-group programs that focus on interaction and which fund that interaction should probably never entirely replace identity funding programs. As has been found in Amsterdam, where they tried to do that, and as we saw in the quote from the community services manager in Dandenong, people need to be part of acknowledged communities of familiars, even as they reach out from there to new interactions in micropublics. I want to say that I think we in urban studies are lucky to have our understanding of the importance of place. for it grounds the norms we work with and also shows us how social processes, including interactions, are space and time contingent and are co-present. Our need to be accountable to the way things are in places would probably rescue any of us from too singular a focus on identity groups in isolation, because we would always observe the interactions they have in any place they inhabit as a matter of course in the everyday. So I want to end just by wondering really how all of our own research and practice on urban diversity and the social would be repositioned if we pushed away from attribute definition and recognition as one of our major norms. Perhaps we could come to see diversity, that slippery term, as not primarily about singling out and being accountable to difference, but as about finding differences sitting together collectively and being experienced in counterpoint to sameness. Thanks.